Well, welcome back to International Trade and Prosperity Week, everyone. We had a terrific session this morning on the general state of play across the digitalization agenda. It was absolutely amazing with some of the great people that are involved in driving this whole agenda. For those who haven't missed sessions, please do go to our YouTube account. We're publishing all the sessions straight after they go live in the conference. Please use your networking facility to talk to each other, the chat room to talk to us and everybody in this session. And then don't forget the Q&A function. We'll be passing questions to the speakers on the panel during the session and look forward to answering your questions. This session is all about a big report that's being published today in partnership with Monetigo, our flagship, one of our flagship sponsors for the whole conference week. This is about shutting fraudsters out of trade. What we're going to do here is talk a little bit about the report, understand what the report's trying to do, and begin to socialize the subject more broadly than beyond just the finance community. It's important, and there are important economic opportunities here, and the solutions are more simple than you think, actually, in many ways. So it's really, really important. In the context of why are we publishing this report? We've got a commitment here at the Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation in the UK to really push the boundaries on digitalization, not just focus on trade transactions and interoperable systems, but look at other parts of the system. How do they connect? What are the sort of common themes that run through those? And you're going to hear some of that today. So this is really, really relevant, and really encourage all of you to help us promote the report, start the conversation, and let's continue that throughout next year as well. So I'd like to invite Eleanor Ragg, who many of you know from the Global Trade Review, who's been a big part of drafting the report and putting it together. An enormous amount of work's gone on from the Monetigo team over the last weeks and months. Eleanor, can I hand over to you to take the panel forward?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. So as you just said, as Chris just said, this panel is really going to center around this incredibly important report that's been released today that illustrates the scale of the issue of fraud in trade and also the barriers and the opportunities to tackling it. But the big thing is it provides solutions, right? Including the topic discussed in the panel earlier on today, which is that smarter use of technology to reduce the risk. So the central tenet of the report is the need for cross-industry collaboration. And the panel we've brought together today is a great example of that. So I'll just invite all of the panelists on screen, just briefly introducing everyone. We've got Ben Arbour, who's the Managing Director for the US and Canada at Monetigo, Todd Burwell, who's the President of BAFT, Sean Edwards, the Chair of ITFA, Sam Matthew, who's the Global Head of Documentary and FI Trade at Standard Chartered, and Stefan Wolf, CEO at the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, or GLEAF. So thanks to everybody for joining us. Ben, I'm going to bring you in first because this paper was obviously commissioned with Monetigo. It's available for people to download. It's out there sort of on the ICC website, so people can have a look through. But I wondered if you could give us a bit of an insight into, why now? Why produce this white paper now? And what are the key takeaways that people need to be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks, Chris and the ICC for the opportunity. So I think, firstly, one of the driving factors that we felt why there was a need for a call to action as an industry around fraud in trade was the sheer scale and persistence of fraud. If you think about trade and finance and working capital and trade finance more broadly that drives trade, one of the world's leading strategy consultancies estimates that around 1% of financing is fraudulent. Now, if you think that that actually excludes fraud between buyers and suppliers, suppliers and buyers, and if you think about the world trading system being approximately 21, 22 trillion, 1% plus is a huge number. Bloomberg estimates that in the 6 years to 2020, over 10 billion was lost in Singapore alone by lenders. And I think if you look at the media on a day-to-day basis, there's constant coverage of significant large frauds, whether it's Heng Leong in Singapore, Greensill, Arena recently in the UK, Wirecard in Germany, which doesn't include the day-to-day domestic frauds within many of the world's leading trading nations. So I think if we look at typologies underpinning fraud in trade, there's a significant breadth of different types of drivers for fraud. Many of the big frauds, you see multiple different typologies. Financial statement misrepresentation, creation of fake companies, hiding of ultimate beneficial owners through complicated structures, fake documents, financing of transactions multiple times through multiple lenders, creation of fake collateral, vendor impersonation, using technology to hack into vendors to create fake invoices and using confidence trickster business email compromise schemes to trick payers out of funds. So a real, breadth and depth and complexity of typologies in fraud in trade. It's worth briefly touching on some of the psychology behind fraud in trade, where most of the literature tends to focus on three key types. One, genuine criminals, organized criminals, white-collar criminals who go into commercial arrangements with malintent. Two, tricksters who genuinely believe that they're acting in accordance with the law and regulation, with a huge level of self-delusion. Bernie Madoff is probably the obvious example of an individual in that category. And then folks in positions of responsibility, which may be just someone in an operations department, an accounting department, or could be a CEO or a founder running a potentially legitimate business, but then for whatever reason, commencing down the road of trying something which is outside the ethical norm or regulation or law. And I think financial institutions, banks, the ecosystem more broadly trying to address fraud need to consider all of those typologies. It's not just direct clients, it's not just counterparties, it's not just an onboarding challenge. It's really broad and deep across the lending ecosystem. I think maybe the final point, and apologies for the long introduction, setting the scene. Fraud is a predicate crime. Fraud is about defrauding an institution, a company, and obtaining ill-gotten gains. Most of the banking and finance industry's focus, aside from fraud in the financial crime risk space, is around downstream crimes. So fraudsters, looking to launder money, evade taxes, evade sanctions, bribery, is all about having funds and using it. Fraud is a predicate crime, which should be put alongside all the other crimes around obtaining funds in an ill-gotten way, including theft, for example. And I think genuinely the regulatory, governmental, multilateral community has done some fantastic work around fraud, but the persistence of fraud and the nature of it being a predicate crime probably requires even more focus. So these were some of the key reasons why at Monetigo and with the ICC we felt the need to create this white paper and a real common industry call for action.
Fantastic. Thanks. That's actually a really good scene setter. And there's a lot to kind of unpack there, which is why I'm glad that we've got this panel of experts that can do that. Todd, I think I'll bring you in, because if we sort of go to Ben's comments, the big figures there, right? And all of the media coverage, a lot of our coverage at GTR, for example, has been around these huge high profile fraud cases that have caused financial loss, reputational damage to banks. And they do seem to keep on happening, right? Now, I know that you recently held a BAFT Connect session that was sort of shining the spotlight on fraud in trade. And you brought together various practitioners, right, to discuss what needs to be done. What was the kind of sentiment, from participants? How alive are people to the issue of fraud in trade?
So, well, first, thank you for having me here. And I think in Ben's introduction, he touched on quite a few things that were talked about at that session. And, my own personal observations as we were talking about the different topologies, how this manifests, what some of the necessary controls are, et cetera, is I couldn't help but draw the similarities to trade-based money laundering, which we spent a lot of time over the last decade or so trying to analyze and trying to identify what role banks could actually play in mitigating it. But it's something that Ben pointed to that I think differentiates fraud from some of those trade-based money laundering cases is really, and it's the burden of proof that a beneficiary knowingly attempts to defraud the parties. And so during that session, there was a look at several cases. And if you look at, I think there were maybe 5 cases that were highlighted in 2020. And of those 5, 4 of them involved duplicate invoices. 3 of them involved specifically fraudulent documents. So then if you kind of work that back to how do you mitigate that and how you solve for that, it really does point to how do you create perhaps digital tracking of these original invoices, right? And that's one incentive to move away from paper to a more digital solution. The other is, I think, some of the red flags, and we went through this analysis back when we looked at TBML as well, but some of the red flags that come up in transactions, banks are increasingly expected to pull the threads on those red flags. You know, if I go back decades ago when I was introduced to this business, one of the things that stuck in my head was banks deal in documents, not in goods, and that banks are responsible for documents on their face. Well, that doesn't really apply in today's world because of what we've seen in the expansive nature of fraud and money laundering. You know, banks really do have to go beyond just the face of the documents to try to mitigate this.
Yeah. I think on that, I'll bring Sam in, because Sam, obviously you're sort of bringing the bank perspective here, and banks really are on the front lines of trade finance fraud, right? I mean, essentially the trade frauds are being perpetrated by clients. So just to Todd's point there, you know, is there more that you could be doing, not you individually, but as banks, on due diligence? You know, do the resources even exist for you to do kind of more transactional checks to predict and combat that fraud? Sam, you're on mute.
Sorry, there goes. I need to buy the beers now. Thanks, Eleanor. Look, I have a slightly, as a practitioner at least, and this is my personal view, I have a slightly different view and take on this. Yes, you know, we are at the forefront of trade finance, and therefore we are very close to the frauds that happen, and no bank likes to lose money. No lender likes to lose money. No clients like to lose money. But I think if you, you know, going back a little, take a step back, I think there are many fraud typologies, as Ben kind of alluded, so I won't repeat that. The AML piece that we as an industry did a lot of red flags, and I personally think we have overdone it. If you look at how many of those red flags really add value from an AML perspective, I think it's probably overdone. And I think we're at danger of probably overdoing it on the fraud case as well. At it, if you only look at the transactional element, because when I look at these frauds, I would say 8 out of 10, and maybe even 9 out of 10 times, it is perpetrated by first parties, i.e. the client. I see very little. There are some third-party frauds where, you know, a third party has gained access to the client system or so on. But more often than not, it is the intent of a client or a particular individual within the client's organization to defraud. And there are ominous signs of this well before the fraud actually happens. You know, sales performances that look too good to be true. You know, patterns in terms of he's always been dealing in iron ore and suddenly is doing cement, or a completely new corridor with a market that they have not dealt with. I think to me it boils down to, yes, strengthening the transactional controls without overburdening the operational side of things to detect fraud, but at the same time taking a step back and looking at the macro picture at a client and the portfolio level signs that if when we do back testing today, and if we had done a few things right, we could have probably detected some of the frauds that eventually hit us. That may have been very difficult to detect with a transactional red flag. So I think a long-winded answer, but I think getting your client due diligence right and looking for things we can improve there to detect early signs, because as I think Ben alluded, one of the typologies where the client may start good but go rogue at some point because of stress, because he or she has invested in the stock market or in derivatives and lost money there, and you're trying to now fix that problem and create more problems. So yes, transactional controls are important. We should probably look at them in the context of these typologies, and most banks are. But I think a more important thing we are missing probably as an industry. For example, all of us are regulatorily required to file SARs and suspicious transactions reports, STRs. But it's very confidential information. I may be doing that, but bank B might be dealing with the same client and still issuing facilities. So how do we at an industry level, beyond transactional, share client information that the regulator does know, the banks do know, but they do it individually? To how do we improve client due diligence, with that being a part of it, in terms of looking for signs, patterns, etc. And just to give you one example, if a client has a top line of $1 million, he should not be doing LCs worth $10 million, right? And there'll be nothing transactionally wrong with the LC, just that it does not fit the client requirement in terms of based on his business size and sales turnover, etc. So yes, in short, we need to look at the client side. How do we leverage all the intelligence we have at a macro level, at a portfolio level, in the context of the client's business before we keep continuing to give facilities to the client? And once that facility is given, okay, what can we do more on a transactional level without overburdening the system? Back to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Sam. I think that's an incredibly important point. This idea about not further burdening banks with more and more compliance, because if you look into the report, it talks about the trade finance gap. And if you look into the ADB's research into the trade finance gap, one of the major contributors is that kind of regulatory and compliance burden that banks have. That means the cost to serve is just simply not economical. So that's a super important point about tackling fraud needs to be done in such a way that trade finance remains accessible to all. And that brings me nicely to Sean, because earlier today we sort of heard about digitization and about the way that digital can reduce the kind of burden, the manpower needed to carry out all sorts of things in trade. Now, ITFA's obviously been playing a real leadership role in a lot of these digitization efforts. So I wanted to bring you in, Sean, just to get your view on the kind of role that the wider ecosystem can play in addressing these market failures that I think both Sean and both Sam rather and Todd have alluded to.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Eleanor. So I mean, it's an important question that you're asking. We've had we've seen from Ben the scale and the scope and the complexity of fraud. Todd mentioned things such as invoice fraud, but in my other job, in my day job, actually was exposed to Hin Leong, and that wasn't just about invoices, right? That was about basically a vertically integrated what became a fraud factory. So it wasn't enough just to follow the invoices. There was a lot of duplication of other documents, and I think that probably points us to the fact, yes, as Sam was saying, we can have a lot of, and there is a lot of technology, and we should know our clients. And actually, this is where KYC starts to sort of, this is where it starts to be good, as it were. This is where we start to get benefits from that regulatory burden. That actually it helps us to manage our credit risk better. But actually, what we need, and I think what the whole ecosystem or what the trade finance industry is trying to move towards, and this is where we've been playing a big part actually, is to firstly eliminate paper, but also to make digitization itself by design capable of making it more immune to fraud. So if I take the Hin Leong example, if that was all based around paper, right? Largely duplication of paper. Now, if we if that hadn't existed and it was all digitized, would we have had a better insight into what Hin Leong was doing? And I think probably yes, we would have done, because we would have seen that actually there were multiple financings going on, that there were cargoes were being used for more than one letter back, more than one letter of credit. So actually setting up an ecosystem, a digital ecosystem in which by design, and it's not maybe necessarily the primary intention of this, because primary intention of digitization of trade is to make it more efficient, to make it more accessible. But actually, by making it more traceable, we can reduce fraud, I think, as a sort of side benefit. So in IFA, what we've been doing is very much about, and we were talking earlier on in the roundtable just before this, about trade finance as opposed to trade, and actually digitizing those instruments, which is what we've been trying to do in our D&I initiative, and actually then following that through into the distribution to the secondary market through our TFDI initiative, the Trade Finance Distribution Initiative. But the DNI, sort of the primary market, that's all about digitizing trade instruments. Now, once you've done that, they're much harder to hack, much harder to copy. That's true, but they also create their own, effectively their own registry. And I think this is where we're heading to. I mean, this has happened obviously in Singapore. I think it's a bit of a vain hope to think that we're going to have some sort of global register of all letters of credit or all invoices. But actually being able to trace those, or being able to have an understanding of what those are through interoperable digital standards is something that can definitely reduce the sort of fraud that we've seen.
Yeah, I like that, because it's really solutions focused. And so I'll bring in Stefan, who is providing a solution. I think just going back just very briefly to one thing Sean said there about, being able to create this registry, being able to authenticate, being able to kind of identify what's happening across the trade ecosystem. And that's very much something that Stefan, you've been doing with the LEI. So I just wanted to kind of pull you in here as a solution provider, really, to, find a bit more about how can more adoption maybe of the LEI support kind of, better trust, better authenticity. Can your solution be leveraged to help stamp out fraud?
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor, and welcome from my side as well to everyone. First of all, a very mild correction. We're not providing a solution. We're not selling software. We're not selling data, anything like that. Life is a not-for-profit foundation under the oversight of 71 global regulators who have, identified one of the problems, which was identity during the financial crisis, and created a standard and created a governance framework for that standard. And Life is the managing organization for that. So the closest analogy is a global business register. And maybe one more word to that: since there is no global government, and since there is no global taxpayer, this cannot be organized as a global government function. And that's why we have created the system with the three-tier model, where we have the oversight, we have Life, and then we have the issuers and the registrars for that. Now, coming back to the topics that my fellow colleagues here raised, I would like to add that trust must be earned. We're all used to that phrase, right? But that is contradictory to what we see in real world when it comes to acceleration and computer-to-computer transactions at real-time speed. So how can you earn trust if you're working on a brokerage side, and you broker your deals and things like that, rather than establishing a long-lasting relationship where you know the people personally and all of that? So the acceleration of global trade, in my opinion, is the reason why we see more fraud. Because technology is vulnerable, especially when you run transactions over the internet. And I think today we do not see these private networks anymore. Everybody, sends stuff over the internet. And as we all know, the internet was built without identity. So we need to do something about this, right? And what we are proposing is, first of all, identity should be global for all these use cases, whether it's supply chain, whether it's environmental control, ESG reporting, whether it's risk management, payment. we should agree on one standard for identity that is linked to the national schemes. And that's what the LEI proposes. But then, in order to provide authenticity, meaning computational trust, verification of anything, we also need a computational layer of trust. And that is with all the crypto algorithms and where all of this new technology comes in, right? And lots of people working on that topic in blockchain and you name it, right? So we need to think about both. We need to think about identification and we need to think about authentication. And that's where we're here to help for. And to foster adoption, it is very clear that if the LEI presents business value to a holder, for instance, because it's faster for you to onboard with a client with a bank, for instance, or whether it's easier to get a supplier relationship in place, then we believe that the next step for the LEI system, we covered 90% of market capitalization, the big guys already, but now it's for the subsidiaries and for the SMEs. And I would like to give you one example where this worked very nicely. We did a project in Zimbabwe, and the bank in Zimbabwe became part of the issuing network of life for Zimbabwean companies, mining corporations and other firms. And the reason was that they want to help those companies to participate in global trade. And that means visibility, that means verification, and everything else is very important. How can you deal with a country where you have no trust in the legal system, for instance? I'm not saying that Zimbabwe has a weak system, but in general, right? So taking the trust from that level down to the company level is an important aspect of, letting people, participate and benefit from global trade.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really key, sort of talking about the how, right? I think that's really important. And the fact of the matter is, like you've just said, the solutions do exist and they have been put into practice in various other areas. There are loads of questions coming in from the audience, as can be expected for a topic as important and cross-cutting as this. Please do keep them coming. We will try and get to as many as we can. And if we don't manage to get around to all of them, I'm sure that our panelists will be happy to sort of take these offline. There's one actually that's quite interesting. I think perhaps it might be one for you, Todd, because it does refer back to your comments at the beginning, which is, why is it that fraud is treated differently to trade-based money laundering when it is, a crime with economic consequences? Is that an oversight for the regulators? And to add to that, do we think that perhaps in the future regulators will start treating it in an equivalent manner?
So I'm not a lawyer, so I have to caveat my answer in that regards. But it's interesting because, and I'll just use the U.S. as an example. If you look at the average penalties for fraud and the average penalties for money laundering, they're significantly higher for money laundering than they are for fraud. Which, if you intuitively think about fraud being a conscious effort to defraud someone, your first instinct might be, well, shouldn't that be penalized more significantly? But I think with money laundering, there's often different levels of structuring and organized enterprise that goes along with it. I think if we were to, and I don't have the raw statistics, but I think if you were to look at the incidence of who's committing fraud versus who's committing money laundering penalties, that may also have something to do with why the sentencing and judicial treatment is somewhat different from that. I think, and this kind of goes back a little bit to the point that Sam raised, but maybe it's a slightly different perspective that I have, which is that money laundering and trade-based money laundering, if I can put myself into the mind of the criminal, they're really not thinking about specifically defrauding or committing a crime against a person or organization, right? Their crimes have taken place someplace else, and now they just need to find a place to park the money, right? Whereas when we're talking about frauds, in particular trade fraud, there is a conscious effort to target an entity. And so I do think that from a bank's point of view and a bank's client's point of view, there is a higher level of due diligence and protection that they ought to be putting in place, just because they are in fact the targets of those frauds.
Absolutely. There's another question that I'd like to bring Ben in on, because I think it speaks to one of the points raised in the paper about the siloization, if that's even a word, of global trade and why trade is susceptible to this kind of fraud. So the question is that there are now very sophisticated fraud detection and alert systems in consumer banking. Why is it that trade and corporate banking is so different? Why don't we just have the same systems in place? I think that's one for you, Ben.
Yeah, sure. Happy to have a crack at it, and then maybe Sam, as a current practitioner, me as an ex-practitioner, can chime in.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great question, and with a focus on corporate banking, I could say, well, when you're dealing with companies rather than individuals in the retail space, there's a greater level of complexity, which is probably true. I think also there are some sophisticated solutions in place at the moment in the industry broadly around detecting fraud on the corporate and trade finance side, which include, some really fantastic levels of insight into counterparties, around contextual monitoring, the ability to understand your customer's customer, your customer's supplier. Likewise, some really phenomenal feeds from a data perspective, helping investigators when a red flag is detected. Certainly there could be more. I think one of the potential barriers is the regulatory concerns around data comparing and data sharing, where, going back to Todd's example from a US perspective, FinCEN investigators from the FIU perspective have access to 300 million records when they're looking at any individual focus. None of the banks can see that, right? And these are suspicious activity reports which really provide insight. And I think from a legislative perspective, there is a winds of change coming to allow banks to be able to share information more broadly across borders within different entities. For example, the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, which is broader than ML. But I think it's restrictions on data, which are part of the reasons why we don't see more sophisticated tools in fraud detection in banking.
Absolutely. I think you've pretty much covered it. I wanted to bring in Stefan, actually, because I think, Stefan, you've always been, for all the conversations I've had with you, a proponent for sort of, linking together digital islands. And I think there's a key point to be raised here in answer to that question. Now, I'll hand to you and then I think to Sam.
To echo what others have said already, maybe from a different angle, look at sanctions regimes in general. All firms operating internationally have to be aware of sanctions in order to avoid fines, for misbehavior. We looked at the latest sanctions list ourselves, where companies, it's not a ban against the country, it's actually a sanction against companies or their subsidiaries in certain parts of the world. So we looked at the sanction lists just lately, and we figured that it's virtually impossible to automate the identification of those firms. It's all string-based matching, wrong write-ups, wrong names, different understanding of company names, not to mention language barriers. So every firm that operates at the moment in the trade environment, whether it's a bank, a producer, or a customer, dealing with this has to go through this incredibly expensive and complicated exercise. And now people start to use AI and all these algorithms. That's a mean to get to some level of assurance, but you will have also false negatives, false positives. You still need people to look into this. And this is why we believe for trade, for AML, for sanctions, but also for payments and other related aspects, a global identification scheme would actually ease the pain for everyone.
Yeah, brilliant point there. Sam, over to you. Why, how much of a problem is this inability to share data, and why can't you share data?
Yeah, look, I think before we go to that, I think the nature of the beast is slightly different in terms of consumer/retail versus the role a bank plays in commercial trade. And therefore, from a technology and therefore from a data perspective, the systems have evolved to a much larger extent. Almost everything in retail is Either I'm taking a bilateral loan from my bank, which should be pretty straightforward, or it's usually payments or credit card transactions, for which there are, if you look at the Visas, the MasterCards, and other payment providers, they have some sophisticated anomaly detection tools, etc. I think which is what is being referred to in the question. And therefore, there is a pooling of that data across many banks, and it is not done. It is not done voluntarily. It is part of being part of the ecosystem. Every transaction essentially goes through one of these networks, and they are able to look at the data. We do have Swift, but Swift by definition cannot look at the underlying data because that's how it is structured. And the document information is not within Swift. So what are the challenges for sharing that data? One is obviously client confidentiality, regulatory restraints in terms of how you could share the data. My earlier point about even when you know that there is potentially something wrong with a client, you can't share it because it's client confidentiality and regulatory compliance in terms of who that can be shared with, right? Risk of tipping off, etc. So I don't think the technology is a challenge. Consumer has done it, we can do it. But the nature of the beast is very different. I don't think it's as easy to say consumer has done it, why can't we do it in commercial or in trade? Because the role a bank plays in financing 1 million barrels of oil, that is changing hands with the bank having to verify. And to the earlier point, traditionally it was just the documents, but to Todd's earlier point, we need to now go beyond the documents and actually verify that our client is actually right in doing that business, and these documents look original, the trade looks genuine, etc. Is not a role, for example, that it's not an equivalent role that the bank plays in consumer. It is more real time. It is credit checks. It is the commercial side of buying and selling has already happened on Amazon.com or whatever it is, pretty quickly, with settlement following quickly as well. So I think the nature of the business is different. Yes, sharing information is a problem, and detecting anomalies and pattern changes across banks at an industry level, it doesn't exist today, right? So the closest we have is the ICC Trade Register, which is more for credit information. But for anything that is an outlier in terms of flows patterns, there's no industry level data sharing today.
Absolutely. I just want to kind of pause and change tack a little bit there. So we've heard now from all of the panelists, we've heard that, trade finance fraud is a problem. We've heard that the solutions do exist. We've heard that the industry is alive to it. And we've heard about some of the barriers preventing it from being necessarily tackled as well as it could be. And I just want to kind of link back to this white paper that we're sort of discussing today and its calls to action, Ben, because within the white paper, it's got these recommendations, right, for industry, for banks, for regulators, for every participant within the global trade ecosystem. So I just wanted to sort of hand back over to you just to pull out a few of those points in response to some of the points the panelists have raised. I think probably the first one is the regulators. Is there something more that the regulators can be doing? Should they be sort of convening banks together more? Should they be pushing people to do more about this? What are the recommendations in the paper?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eleanor. So I think there's a general consensus around the table, and as per the paper, that regulators could and should do more to address fraud risk across the board.
Yeah,
I think even before the regulator call to action, that there's a broader belief that the industry can help drive change from a banking and finance perspective. And I think one of the key points the paper tries to bring out early on is that trade finance actually helps in the detection of fraud. The greater the level of insight into transactional flows, the greater the chance of detecting fraud. I think Sam is absolutely right that it's critical not to overburden operations teams in trade, receivables finance, invoice discounting, supply chain finance teams. And I think it's a really exciting time if you think about the onboarding CDD point-in-time analysis of a client and their counterparties and their broader business, together with the ongoing monitoring from a transaction perspective as to what they do on a day-to-day basis, and where those two meet in a perpetual know your customer type environment. And I think as that matures and we get to something like perpetual KYC, the ability to detect and prevent fraud will increase significantly. think the other key piece in terms of the recommendations, both for the regulators and for the industry in the white paper, which we've touched on, is the ability, the increasing ability to compare data. Obviously data sources, and we've covered data sources to an extent, but actually comparing them across private and public institutions. And I think there, the key is, it's not about setting a standard. You can take a standardized data-driven approach without setting a standard across entire markets. Obviously, regulators, to your question, Eleanor, are building registries, not just in India, Singapore, and Asia. Also, several European regulators are driving the creation of registries. But we can be simple and tactical and practical and compare grey lists of clients or invoices that are financed across two lending institutions in one market and detect fraud. I know a company that starts with Monet and finishes in a Go that has a solution to facilitate that. But I think aside from that, genuinely, there's the opportunity now to act in a confidential, privacy protecting way and share data between organizations, which may eventually become a standard. But I think it's we don't need to to use a cliche, boil the ocean. There's the ability to use technology and digitization in a tactical way to detect fraud right now.
Fantastic. You'll have to be less cryptic. I've never heard of these Monets guys. I think some of the action points, right, that you brought up is that they need to use data better, they need to collaborate more, they need to sort of get adoption. And so we'll go back around, all the different parts of the industry, because I want to hear from everybody. I think Stefan first on the data point, how can the industry better leverage data and identity to detect and reduce fraud? And is there maybe scope to use rails and standards like ICC and SWIFT that already exist to kind of work better together? What's your take, Stefan?
That's the $1 million question. And it was quite interesting. We had just the other day in another international meeting around the ICC DSI initiative, exactly that question. We have standards out there. I mean, every data element has been standardized, right? We have bill of lading and all of these document types standardized, but the adoption rate of standards is very low. And this is why I would like to put a little bit of water into the wine. We have solutions, but these are products and they're not necessarily interoperate with each other. So that's another part of the complexity. And one of the participants, I found this really enlightening. One of the participants said, who actually makes money by the fact that these standards are not adopted in the market, right? And you can think of the usual candidates for that. So I believe that was in the chat was a comment, why we don't have a national body or an international body that takes care of this. And I think from the example that Life has, where we have an international governance structure, but one core mission, then you can achieve things. So I probably would say that there might be a need for a helping hand here to get this adopted.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, we're speaking, I think it's just over a year now, isn't it, since the UK's top two banking regulators told CEOs across the trade finance sector that more needs to be done to identify fraud. Sean, I'll bring you in on this one, because I know that ITFA engaged a lot with those regulators. And just to Stefan's point, do we need that helping hand? Do we need sort of more explicit expectations to try and solve for this issue?
So, I mean, what I would say is always dangerous to ask the regulator to prescribe exactly what steps you should be taking, and I think it's probably counterproductive as well. I mean, we engaged, as you said, with the UK regulators on that, and actually, interestingly, we engaged on two very specific points that they made in that DCO letter. One was around the use of insurance, the other about receiver SCF finance. And on both of those points, which were very specific, as opposed to the rest of the letter, which was very general, on those specific points, they said, well, actually, sorry, we've sort of got it wrong. You're right. And you don't need to do what we said in the letter. Okay, that's great. So we told the industry about that, and everybody patted my back for about a month, which was wonderful. But we're left with the main thrust of that letter, which is this fraud going on, and they don't mention it by name, but clearly they're referring to Greensill and to what happened in Singapore. And I think it goes back to the point I was making before in the question you first asked me, which is needing to make the whole ecosystem by design immune or less prone to fraud. And I think that is one of the consequences of actually designing a much better digital system. So we've got great tools like that company that begins with M and ends with O. They've got a great tool, but there are others as well. And I think if you've got something that enables you effectively, and we're going to have to get over these sort of data sharing rules, but I think that there's a lot of problems before we even get to that. Organizing a register, even if it's an informal registry. I mean, if it's to fight fraud, most confidentiality and data protection laws are very accommodating. But we're not even at the stage at which we can really share consistent data. And I think sort of it goes back to how can we digitize trade finance better? Can we get a product that's better known? To that we can attach all sorts of things like fraud protection, like this is off the subject, but ESG and credit ratings. This is what we're all waiting for. I mean, last week when we were all at Cybos, there was some great work that Swift are doing around sort of the super connector, and this is the hope. But there's a lot of work to be done before we get there. But I would say, just in finishing, my answer to that question is we should do it, and we shouldn't let the regulators push us into doing something that may be completely inappropriate and unachievable.
I think that's a really, really important point. And on that, I'll bring Todd back in because, like Sean said, this does need to be for the industry, by the industry, because the industry is the only one that really has a handle on some of these kind of products, the complexity of trade finance and so on. Now, you mentioned earlier about, the burden that happens when you've got things like AML regulation, for example, TBML and so on. But I wondered, is there maybe a way or an ability that BAFT could maybe get this trade finance fraud conversation out in the open to get ahead of any potential, misgivings or mistakes or misconceptions around the scale of the problem and the ability of the industry to solve for it?
So it's interesting, and there's a lot of things that are embedded. And I also want to go back to a couple of other comments. So if we go back 5-6 years ago, when we were looking at the problem of trade-based money laundering, and we were able to differentiate between trade finance, as Sean alluded to, versus trade and trade-based money laundering, is because we got to the root, and then we were able to trace it back through the process. I think with frauds, we still have more work to do to really get a full data set that we can understand what the scale is. Just the eyeball test to me says that the trade frauds that we're aware of are really, really big and they're splashy. Does that mean that it's widespread and it happens, across the ecosystem? I'm still not sure. So I think that we have some work to do, and perhaps BAFT can do this. I think there are others who also need to be involved to really get better information about the size and scale of the problem. Now, as it relates to regulators and sharing information, also going back, to this TBML effort, one of our recommendations to regulators was that they need to allow organizations to share information. And I think that was actually heard. And you started to see more informal information sharing opportunities set up. In the UK, you had Gimlet. In Hong Kong, you had Fimlet. In the US, you had the FinCEN Exchange and ASIP in Singapore. So there are structures that the regulators and the law enforcement agencies in several jurisdictions have come together with private sector banks and said, in this network, you are not only allowed to, but encouraged to share information to help prevent fraud and money laundering and things like that. In the US, they've gone so far as to make modifications to the legislation of 314B, where they explicitly encourage sharing of information. So I think the regulatory community will be fairly on side with anything that we want to do from an information sharing point of view to mitigate this. The difficulty is, can we do it in real time to prevent this from happening? or are we doing this after the horse is already out of the barn? And I think that brings us back to some of the studies we have to do around digitizing trade. The last point I'll mention on this, and it does kind of go back to how do we size it, scale it, and get to the root of it? There was an initiative that the Asian Development Bank just kicked off a few years ago that we were part of to try to standardize suspicious activity reporting specifically for trade. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. The intention was to get the FIUs in various countries to agree on sort of standard categories of trade SARs that would then allow us to get better data around how are these things manifesting, and then we can get to the root source of it and figure out better solutions.
Yeah. Ben, I think I saw you had your hand up. Did you have something to add in?
Yeah, just a very quick couple of additions. Totally agree with Todd's points. I think fantastic. I think the efforts from a FIU perspective, Gimlet, etc., are the tip of the pyramid there, the deep investigations. I think bringing it down to the day-to-day level is key. You can envisage a future where both at a CDD KYC level and at a transaction level, a fraud check is similar to a sanctions check. Any entity, any counterparty is immediately checked against potential duplicate financing or fake entity, fake documents, etc. And I think that may seem like a long way away, but my other point is that the technology is effectively there to enable it now. Agreed to all the regulators are supportive where it comes to comparing data in a privacy protecting way. But I think confidential cloud computing gives us that ability to do it right now. So hopefully that kind of a future isn't many years away. And again, I think we can be tactical about it.
Yeah, I want to just bring Sam in because what you've just talked about there, Ben, about the fact that the solutions exist, right? And there are many things that are available now. Sam, just from a sort of Standard Chartered perspective, and this is not just a fraud thing, right? This is a digitization thing that we're talking about, really. You've been involved in various initiatives. You've also obviously been involved sort of convening other banks around things like the trade finance registry, piloting the SWIFT and Monetico solution. What do you think the obstacles are to kind of broader adoption, right? Do we have the incentive design right? Does more need to be done in that respect?
So, I mean, the question is much wider than fraud. It's I guess, digitization in general. If that's the question, I think I'll bring you back to one of the other panels we were on, Eleanor, at Cybos, where DCSA, for example, said that they can, 70% of the world's container carriers are their members, and almost every one of them are digital bills of lading enabled today. However, how many of them are actually issuing the EBLs? And then the question is, why are they not? My counterparty is not on the same platform. So I think, to me, the problem is that the technology exists, but it exists in closed loops. The interoperability of the technology doesn't, not that it can't be done, but it has not happened. And maybe there are commercial reasons and protection of those loops that has probably prevented that from happening so far. But it's high time, I think, that the data sharing between all these platforms, I think, for at least for open account supply chain finance and to some aspects of doc trade, we should be able to solve for sharing that data if we can get the platforms to talk to each other, right? And then when I look at a parallel, and I think I quoted this same example on the other panel as well, Eleanor, right? So, one industry that had this problem of having a lot of paper and completely did away with it is the airline industry, right? I mean, all of us used to get paper tickets 20 years ago, and today none of them exist, and no two people, turn up at the airport for the same seat on the same airplane. And because they have solved for that with a centralized interoperable booking system that all agents and all airlines can use. Trade is slightly more complex than that, because that seat is then further traded between passengers. That makes it definitely a lot more complex. But long-winded answer, but I think the nut crux of it is that I think we need to drive interoperability in the industry from a data and platform perspective, both in the open account and the digital BL space. That will, apart from mitigating risks, I think drive utilization and scalability, because that's one of the other problems. A lot of these platforms are not seeing scale. Why that the reason is? Why is the reason for that? There could be a multitude of issues. Many of the clients probably are just wanting to dabble in digital without wanting to change their processes. But because remember, when you go from paper to digital, it is a huge change on your side of the process as well, as a procurement shop, or as a sales and fulfillment shop. So that does require some cost and then some effort, some investment. So there could be an element of, let me test this out. It's a pilot. I've ticked the box, but how do we scale that up? Second, I think more complex problem is my counterparty is not on the same platform, and I can't join all these other platforms. How do we? That's where the interoperability point comes in. So let me just stop there, because I think if you could solve for these, then I think you'll see scalability happening, and then mitigation happening, or helping the data, helping the mitigation to a larger extent.
Exactly. So far, we've heard from all of the panelists kind of addressing those action points that were called for in the paper. I want to just give the audience a chance, because there are so many questions coming in, and there are some really, really good ones from all areas. So I'm going to ask very kindly if we can sort of stay on for a few more minutes and answer quite a few of these. There's a really interesting one here that I'd like to go to first, and it's from John Taylor, who's the Professor of International Finance and Trade Law at Queen Mary. And he asks, could the resources of Transparency International be helpful in helping to confront fraud in trade? And I think that's a really interesting example of potential wider collaboration and cooperation outside of the kind of trade bubble. Would anybody like to take that?
Yeah, shall I have a stab at that? Because yeah. I mean, I think in a sense that's already happening, but not in relation to fraud. It's happening in relation to KYC AML. At my own bank, we have a wide variety of sources. They will include, I believe it does include Transparency International. And that, of course, is widely available public information. So that sort of thing is happening. I think it's not, again, I mean, it was sort of partly the point that Sam was making. This is not happening necessarily in the context of fraud, and you have to ask yourself why that's the case. Why aren't we joining up? Why aren't we joining up these systems? Now, I think part of the reason actually is that banks often, and it's Sam's made the point very well, that it's unlike retail or other areas of banking. It's very fast moving. Settlement happens very quickly, and it's very competitive. You don't want to annoy your client by suggesting that actually this may be fraudulent. I mean, nobody of the many banks that banked in Lyon, nobody was suggesting to them that this velocity of trade actually was actually fraud. Nobody stopped them for that. So there are very different considerations here, and I think a very different factual environment where things move more quickly. So yeah, you can sometimes spot fraud after the event, and that may help you. Where it's somebody like in Lyon, that's basically, as to use the phrase I used earlier, basically became a sort of vertically integrated fraud factory. But it's not so much the sources. It's sort of how quickly you get those. It's what you do with them. But also, and I was sort of harping on a bit about this, about excluding fraud by design, but actually having a system that means that actually I can have a high degree of confidence in the way that trade has been structured, the instruments involved, the payment, rails that it's going through, and that actually makes it easier actually to compare to what's going on in the rest of the market. But that, I think, is a really important, way of doing it. And we talked about registers. Now, Singapore's has got a formal register. We've heard there might be some other countries also creating registries. They are a very hard thing to do at scale, and I think again, we have to go back to the way the private sector could solve this, which is to have essentially easily exchangeable data standards. And then I think that then becomes a lot easier. You know, it's a bit like the ICC trade register, right? There's a lot of data around, but actually formatting that to put it into the trade register, which is a great product, is very difficult. Now, I think if we can get over that, then I think and we talked about this, and Todd mentioned as well, that actually sharing data for fraud prevention purposes is something that the regulators support. And I think, but you know, we do need to improve the instruments and the data standards that we use, and then I think we'll be in a much better place. So that's an answer to that question, but actually it really answered another one.
Yeah, I think you've answered several questions there, Sean. Thank you.
Value for money there, Eleanor.
Exactly. There's another really interesting question sort of from the tech side. So I'll bring in Stefan on this. It comes from Meryl Sengos, who's a digital trade finance expert and consultant at FinChain Trade Finance Consultancy. And Meryl asks, regarding the digital identity point that was raised, a third-party identity provider would gain all trade secrets. Also, centralized digital identity providers represent a single point of failure. How can we figure out these challenges? Over to you, Stefan.
And I found this question really a good one, forward-looking as well. So thank you for that. And the reason is the following. We see applications out there where the sheer access to identity information or just a request to a computer can get locked in log files and analyzed and so on and so forth. So we have an example from the pharmaceutical industry where we have the highest degree of confidentiality, and just, you know, pulling a leaflet for a medicine could be misused in terms of knowing more about who's behind that. So we need not more centralization. This is not the gigantic, big global digital identity thing that everybody has to subscribe to. I personally believe we need decentralized identity, where we put a lot more freedom and flexibility into the hands of the corporates for what they want to do with their employees, their customers, their suppliers, and so on and so forth. That requires, and I mentioned this in the chat, something that is called a zero trust architecture. And don't get confused, it doesn't mean no trust in the world. It simply means you can verify the source and you can verify the information every single time.
Fantastic. Another question that came in asks, should we be developing a toolkit for global supply chains so that all parties are working together to adopt LEIs and tech solutions, etc.? I think that might be the ICC WTO standards toolkit, but I will hand over to somebody more expert than me to answer that question. Any takers? Don't all rush at once. Sam?
Look, I think the short answer would be yes. But again, I don't think there's a lack of standards. I think to the earlier point that was made, you know, I mean, GLEI exists today. Stefan is on the call. Standards for EBL exist today. But the question is, why are the platforms that have evolved as closed loops, why are they not, you know, using that and achieving interoperability at the same time? I don't think generating another toolkit or a set of standards will solve the problem. I think the real problem is how do we get these digital islands to talk to each other, and what is I think there was a good question asked earlier. Who's making money if there's no interoperability or there's no scaling of the digital solutions, because clearly the inefficiency also results in some benefit to some people in the ecosystem. So a toolkit will be welcome, but I don't think that is a panacea for solving a global supply chain problem, because within closed loops, within platforms, that has been solved. So, and I don't want to name any one particular one. We as a bank work with a few. We are seeing a ramp up and scale up, especially in the open account supply chain space. Where publicly we have announced a few. Again, I will not mention them here, but we are starting to see ramp up on that, especially in deep tier supply chain, which I think was well discussed at the GTR event in Singapore. Yeah. So within closed ecosystems, these have been solved. If you want to make it global with an architecture, to Stefan's point, of decentralized. We don't really need a central registry, with decentralized registries on client identity and so on, but the information actually handshaking and portability or interoperability happening between platforms, that would be nirvana. How and when do we get there? Is a question I don't have an answer to.
Fair enough. We've got time for, I think, one or two more questions before we kind of bring this back on track to a conclusion. But there is a really good question that came through, which is, why aren't the corporates demanding solutions? Surely they're paying as the fraud costs get passed on. Ben, I think that's one for you.
Yeah, happy to have a go. I think the answer is they are. I think, across the board, corporates are losing money and are hurting as a result of direct fraud with counterparties. I think supplier impersonation is a typology that doesn't get enough airplay, where buyers are being tricked into playing, a fraudster impersonating their supplier. And I think we'll probably see a significant uptick in future, given the ability for fraudsters to infiltrate supplier systems, using, for example, deep fake type technology, in addition to standard business email compromise and creation of fake invoices, where everything looks the same but the bank account. And I think, there's been an uptick already in vendor impersonation through the pandemic, where there was often a link to PPE type scams as well. I tend to compare that to the point of the question, the liability shift in credit cards, where the merchants were stuck with the fraud losses for many years until it suddenly became the bank's problem, and that drove innovation like chip and pin and greater levels of security. We don't see a huge amount of forthcoming legislation to move those losses to the banks, but that may be a trend that's going to manifest itself in future. But I think there is a significant demand from the corporate space through industry associations, trade bodies, etc., for greater levels of protection. For me, it kind of tends to come through in sort of education, lots of sort of training on how to avoid being scammed and tricked. But I think we'll see increasing demands from the corporate space and more being done about it in the near term and medium term.
Fantastic. And one very, very final question. There's a couple of questions that came through about the extent to which government should be more engaged. We spoke about regulators, but I think this is very much more the kind of whole of government aspect. This questioner says, as an example, the UK lost £1.4 billion in PPE fraud, for example. So why aren't governments more engaged with this trade finance fraud conversation? I don't know if Sean, perhaps you might want to pick that one up, or...
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the recent fraud losses have been in the context of COVID, and in addition to PPE fraud, of course, you had fraud on COVID support schemes. That's been a massive loss to the UK exchequer, and I think this, part of the reason that's happened is because these schemes and these purchasing programs have been put in place extremely quickly by the governments because of the urgent need. Or because of a perceived political need, without doing a lot of the checks, and I think at a certain level, what we have already in the context of KYC, and I again go back to the point I made earlier, that actually this is one of the good benefits, one of the good consequences of doing KYC AML, but we could do a lot better, and it sort of taps into what Stefan was saying about trust and identity as we continue to be global. That is something that needs to be done. It needs to be capable of being done very quickly and very easily, especially true in the context of fraud. So why aren't governments more engaged? Well, I think a lot of it is. A lot of it is because the fraud that they themselves have incurred. That's the cost of doing business, right? As a government, it's better that I've lost 100 million procuring PPE, but I've managed to spend 500 million on actually buying proper equipment for for my citizens, and therefore they haven't died. I mean, that's the sort of calculation that's going on there. The rest of it actually really, I think, is being left to, slightly going to disagree with Ben here, because I think, corporates are asking for us, but I think a disproportionate amount of the burden of fraud actually falls on banks. And I think this is why banks are a little bit more active in this area. There are tools, as we mentioned, but there are better ways in which we can join up our efforts. But I just get the feeling that the government is in a way leaving it to us, and I would say personally that's not a bad thing. We need to deal with it.
Fantastic. That's pretty much all we've got time for. So I do want to sort of just pull together all of these very many disparate threads of conversation here, because I think just the wide scope of this conversation and the wide scope of all the questions have come in really do demonstrate just how cross-cutting an issue this is, right? Trade by its very nature is global, right? It's cross-border. It involves multiple different counterparties in various different industrial sectors, various different geographies. And looking at the white paper and hearing from the participants today, it's clear that, there is a problem. There is an issue in terms of fraud in trade finance. It is having various impacts, but it's not necessarily an insurmountable issue. And the key takeaway for me here is pretty much a perennial one, right? The industry needs to come together, have a frank conversation about the issue, identify the extent and scope of the issue, which it started to do with this white paper, collaborate, adopt the solutions that are already available, and then close the gaps so that trade can be better and faster and cheaper for exporters all around the world. I think we're going to take some of the questions that have come in offline, but I'd just like to thank all of our panelists very much for their insights, for their generosity with their knowledge, and also thank very much to our audience for joining us. Chris, I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. What a fantastic and interesting dialogue. I mean, I think you've summarized it perfectly there. I mean, I'm busy scribbling, in terms of this is, in a way, kind of classic trade territory, isn't it? And certainly for ICC, as well as it for another BAFT and other organizations, it's that, somebody needs to convene, somebody needs to encourage and foster collaboration, and then we need to collectively adopt some sort of uniform common solutions, even if those are simple to begin with. I don't disagree. There was a really good point made in the chat room just now that, that we shouldn't just jump straight to technology solutions. We need to look at the systems that we've got. We need to look at the data that we've got, and then, what's the solution? There's an order to that conversation, not just jumping straight to number 3. And that's certainly a takeaway on a very, very practical level. Look, I think we've achieved our goal today. The report is now out there. Certainly from our perspective at ICC here in the UK, this is all about socializing this conversation. All we need is your help, everyone listening, watching, to take this debate beyond this panel and today, and let's continue the conversation into the end of this year and into next year. I think we can solve some of this problem. I think it's perfect. It's not insurmountable, to Eleanor's point. I think it's perfectly actionable. It's absolutely relevant, as Stefan has made several times, on some of these common solutions that apply right across the board, like LEIs. Do support the LEI campaign that launched today. That's all about getting more awareness into the market. We know not enough companies are either using them or have them, in fact. And it's all about utilizing those foundational standards, those foundational tools to then build long-term sustainable solutions. So thank you so much. Just a final thank you to our sponsors, in this case, Monetigo, but also JTI and Inigio as well for the conference overall. If you missed the session or you want to promote the session to colleagues, it's all on YouTube. We really welcome that continued kind of viewing, that continued debate, and let's keep working on this area. I think it's exciting. I think it's a massive opportunity. I think we need to do a lot more to engage our governments. There's an awful lot of economic opportunity for them, having stretched public finances. We've got a common enemy, if you like, and a common goal here. So let's really leverage that to the maximum. Our next session, so this wraps up day 3 of the conference. Tomorrow is our final day, where we'll be looking at responsible business conduct and the role that plays, which is connected to this. We touched on it today. We'll be talking to the OECD and Unilever in that conversation. about the role of responsible business conduct through global value chains. Really, really important, and I think a really timely conversation after yesterday and today in particular. So thank you very much, everybody. Look forward to seeing you at 2 o'clock in a British Standard Time tomorrow. Thank you.